Let me ask you something that might feel uncomfortable. What happens when both people stop reaching out and the silence gets loud? No texts, no calls, no hey, just checking in, just space. Most people think this is the moment everything dies. But what if I told you this is often the moment everything is decided? Because when two people stop contacting each other, something far more important than conversation begins to speak: value, attachment, and emotional truth. Here's the mistake most people make when communication stops. They assume silence means disinterest. It doesn't. Silence reveals who is chasing, who is choosing, and who is actually emotionally invested. You see, when both people stop contacting each other, it creates a psychological vacuum. And nature hates a vacuum. So something always rushes in to fill it: curiosity, insecurity, relief, or longing. And today, I want to walk you through what really happens next, in his mind, in her heart, and in the dynamic between two people who are quietly testing each other without ever saying a word. Because if you understand this moment correctly, you'll stop fearing silence and start using it to gain clarity, power, and emotional truth. Let's talk about what happens after the last message is sent. Silence has a way of stripping everything back to the truth. When two people stop contacting each other, all the distractions disappear: the flirting, the reassurance, the good morning texts, the constant checking in. What's left is not communication, but emotion. And this is why silence is such a powerful revealer of who is actually emotionally invested. You see, when communication is flowing, it's easy to confuse habit with desire. Someone can text you every day not because they feel deeply, but because it's routine, because they're bored, because they like the validation, or because it costs them nothing. Constant contact can hide a lack of real investment. Silence removes that mask. When there is nothing to do, nothing to send, and no prompt to respond to, the only thing that determines whether someone reaches out is how they feel when you are gone. This is where emotional investment becomes visible. The person who is more invested doesn't just miss the messages, they miss you. They feel the absence in their body. They notice the gap in their day. They replay conversations. They wonder what you're doing. Silence creates space, and in that space, emotions either rise to the surface or quietly fade away. For the emotionally invested person, silence is uncomfortable. Not because they are weak, but because attachment has already formed. Their brain has associated you with comfort, excitement, or emotional safety. When you disappear, their nervous system notices. They may try to distract themselves at first. They may tell themselves they're fine. But eventually, the question creeps in. Why haven't I heard from them? That question doesn't come from ego alone. It comes from emotional attachment. For the less invested person, silence feels very different. It may feel neutral. It may even feel like relief. They may notice the absence briefly and then move on with their day. Not because they are cold or cruel, but because the bond simply isn't strong enough to demand attention. Silence, in this case, doesn't create tension. It creates clarity. And this is the part many people struggle with. Silence doesn't create the imbalance of investment, it reveals it. The imbalance was already there. One person was already more emotionally involved, already imagining a future, already prioritizing the connection more. Silence just turns the volume up so you can finally hear it. This is why so many people panic during no contact. They think, if I don't reach out, I'll lose them. But the truth is, if silence causes someone to disappear emotionally, they were already halfway gone. Real investment doesn't evaporate just because there's a pause in communication. If anything, real investment becomes louder in the quiet. Silence also removes control. When you're constantly texting, you can manage impressions, you can keep things light, you can avoid deeper feelings. But when contact stops, you lose the ability to influence how the other person feels in real time. And that's terrifying for the person who is less invested, because they rely on interaction to maintain interest. Meanwhile, the more invested person doesn't need constant input. The feeling exists even without stimulation. Another important truth is that emotional investment isn't always symmetrical. One person may feel deeply but hide it well. Another may appear confident and detached while secretly feeling the absence intensely. Silence exposes this too. People reveal their investment not just by reaching out, but by how they reach out. Is the message thoughtful or generic? Is it curious or transactional? Is it driven by connection or by ego? When someone breaks silence with genuine warmth, curiosity, or vulnerability, it's often a sign of real emotional investment. They're not just checking if they still have access to you, they're checking because they miss being connected. On the other hand, for when someone breaks silence with something flat, like, hey, or, what's up, it can signal uncertainty or ego testing rather than true emotional pull. Full silence also reveals investment within yourself, and this part matters just as much. Ask yourself, are you struggling with the silence because you miss the person, or because you miss the reassurance? Are you missing them, or are you missing how they made you feel about yourself? Silence forces you to confront this honestly, and that awareness is power. If you're the one feeling the silence most strongly, it doesn't mean you've lost. It means you care. The key is what you do with that information. Emotional investment is not a weakness, but unmanaged emotional investment can lead you to chase, overgive, or abandon your own boundaries. Silence gives you the opportunity to pause and ask whether the level of investment you're offering is being matched. For the person who is truly invested and emotionally healthy, full silence doesn't lead to panic, it leads to reflection. They may reach out, but they do so with intention, not desperation. They don't break silence to beg for reassurance. They break it to express genuine interest or to seek clarity. Ultimately, when two people stop contacting each other, the outcome is decided not by who waits longer, but by who feels deeper and who respects themselves more. Silence exposes emotional investment because it removes all the noise. And once the noise is gone, you can no longer pretend not to hear the truth. That's why silence is not something to fear, it's something to listen to. For no contact creates psychological pressure in a way that most people don't even realize until it hits them. When two people stop communicating, when the messages stop, the calls stop, and the notifications disappear, something subtle but powerful begins to happen in the mind of each person. It is almost as if the absence itself starts to speak louder than words ever could. And this is exactly why the no contact period is so transformative. It triggers reactions that are emotional, mental, and even physical. Because humans are wired to respond to connection, to attention, and to the unpredictability of interaction. At first, the silence can feel calm, even liberating. For there's no pressure to respond, no obligation to impress, no constant comparison or questioning. But as the hours, days, and maybe even weeks pass, the calm often turns into curiosity, then into tension, and eventually into real psychological pressure. The mind starts to fill in the blanks. We imagine reasons for the silence, stories about what the other person might be thinking, and scenarios about what might be happening without us. That pressure is unavoidable because when two people stop contacting each other, uncertainty begins to dominate. Humans crave certainty. We want to know where we stand, how we are perceived, and whether we are missed. No contact removes all that reassurance, and our minds cannot help but try to reconstruct it. This pressure works differently depending on the level of emotional investment. For someone who is deeply invested, it can feel almost unbearable. The mind cycles through every interaction, replaying conversations and analyzing words, tone and timing. We start to overthink tiny details, like a pause in a message or a seemingly innocuous comment. Our emotions intensify because we are faced with the possibility of losing something we already value. The brain responds to that potential loss with stress, and that stress manifests in thought patterns that are relentless. Even ordinary moments in the day become colored by the absence. The quiet during lunch, the empty notifications in the evening. The lack of attention at the moments we would normally expect it. All of this creates a tension that is very real and very noticeable. For someone who is less invested, the pressure may be less obvious, but it still exists on a subconscious level. Even if they seem indifferent on the surface, no contact introduces uncertainty. People who are not as emotionally attached may not feel the same urgent longing, but the human brain is wired to notice absence and novelty. Even a person who is detached begins to wonder why the other person hasn't reached out. The curiosity may not be immediate or overwhelming, but over time it creates a subtle pressure, a mental nudge that asks, what changed? Or, am I missing something important? Psychological pressure in no contact also stems from what we might call the loss of control. When people communicate regularly, there is an illusion of influence over emotions, behaviors, and outcomes. Every text, every call, every emoji is a small act of shaping perception. But when the lines of contact go quiet, that control evaporates. Now we cannot gauge the other person's reactions in real time. We cannot influence their day-to-day thoughts about us. This loss of influence is uncomfortable, even frightening. It exposes the fragility of the emotional bonds and forces each person to confront their own feelings without relying on immediate feedback. The brain doesn't like uncertainty. And when it encounters it in such a personal and emotionally charged context, it begins to generate pressure automatically. Another key element of psychological pressure is the role of imagination. In silence, the mind becomes a projector. Every unanswered text, every missed call, every day without contact is a blank canvas onto which we project fears, hopes, and desires. We imagine rejection, disinterest, betrayal, or indifference. We also imagine love, longing, and the hope that the other person is thinking about us. These imagined scenarios are compelling because they feel real in the absence of data. The brain doesn't differentiate well between actual events and vividly imagined ones, so the psychological pressure is real even if the reality is different. For no contact also triggers a natural mechanism called scarcity effect, which is well known in psychology. When someone is absent, their perceived value often increases simply because they are less accessible. The mind begins to notice patterns, qualities, and emotions that might have been taken for granted when constant contact existed. This scarcity can intensify desire, attachment, and anticipation, and that creates another layer of psychological pressure. Suddenly, the lack of communication is not just absence. It is absence that provokes longing and a sense of potential loss, which magnifies the mental tension. Importantly, this psychological pressure is not necessarily negative. In fact, it can serve a powerful purpose. It forces reflection, full self-awareness, and clarity. When there is no external input, people are compelled to examine their own feelings, needs, and boundaries. They ask questions like, why do I feel this way? What do I want from this connection? Am I missing the other person, or am I missing the attention? The pressure created by no contact can act as a mirror, revealing emotional truths that are often masked by constant interaction. It highlights who is truly invested, who is emotionally resilient, and who might be holding on for reasons that are not authentic. For those who handle the pressure well, no contact becomes a tool rather than a trial. It allows them to step back, evaluate their emotions, and make decisions based on clarity rather than compulsion. For those who succumb to the pressure, it can lead to impulsive actions, overthinking, or miscommunication. The difference lies not in the external circumstances, but in how each person interprets and manages the psychological pressure that naturally arises in silence. Moreover, the pressure is cumulative. Each day without contact increases the intensity of the emotional and mental responses. The brain doesn't reset overnight. Each moment of silence builds on the previous ones, layering curiosity, doubt, anticipation, and longing. This cumulative effect can lead to a tipping point where one person finally reaches out, another emotionally opens up, or, in some cases, the pressure exposes that attachment was weaker than assumed. Silence accelerates the unveiling of truth because it compresses the psychological timeline. Ultimately, no contact is a natural stress test for any connection. It reveals the truth about emotional investment, attachment, and the way humans respond to uncertainty. Psychological pressure is not a sign that the connection is failing. It is a signal that the mind is engaging fully with the absence, that emotions are being processed, and that clarity is being sought. It forces both people to confront the reality of their feelings, the depth of their investment, and the potential future of the relationship. Understanding this dynamic is key. If you recognize that no contact creates pressure because of natural human responses, you can approach silence with confidence rather than fear. You can see it as a revealing process, not a punishment. The tension that arises is simply the mind and heart aligning with reality. It is not manipulation. It is not cruelty. It is the honest outcome of removing distractions and leaving two people with only themselves, their emotions, and the unspoken truth of their connection. In the end, psychological pressure during no contact is unavoidable, but it is also enlightening. It exposes attachment, reveals emotional priorities, and encourages reflection. It can either strengthen a bond, create clarity for moving forward, or show that the connection is not as strong as assumed. Silence does not destroy relationships by itself. It simply shows us what is really there, and that, ultimately, is far more valuable than constant communication ever could be. Attraction is one of the most fascinating and mysterious forces in human relationships, and when two people stop contacting each other, that force doesn't vanish, it either grows or collapses. The space created by silence acts like a magnifying glass, intensifying emotions that were already there and revealing how strong the attraction really is. This is why the period of no contact can feel so electric, so tense, and yet so revealing. It's not just absence, it's a pressure cooker for emotions, a test that lays bare the truth about desire, connection, and attachment. When contact stops, the first thing that happens is that the brain begins to fill the vacuum. Humans are wired to seek patterns and consistency in their social relationships. We crave interaction, and we interpret absence as meaningful. For someone who is attracted and emotionally invested, that absence triggers anticipation. The mind begins replaying moments shared, full conversations remembered, laughs that were exchanged, and small gestures that may have seemed insignificant at the time. Each memory becomes a point of longing, a reminder of what is missing. This process is subtle, yet powerful, and it can intensify attraction far more effectively than constant contact ever could. But it's not just memories that fuel this growth, it's the imagination. When a person we are attracted to is suddenly silent, we begin to imagine possibilities. How are they spending their day? Are they thinking of me? Do they miss me? These imagined scenarios create emotional engagement, and in many ways, they can feel more intense than real interactions. Attraction thrives in the unknown because desire is fueled by curiosity and anticipation. The longer the silence, the more the imagination runs wild, and the more emotionally charged the attraction becomes. This is why, paradoxically, stepping back and creating space can be more effective than constant communication. When we are always present in someone's life, they can become desensitized to us. Our presence becomes expected, ordinary, or even taken for granted. But when we stop contacting them, we introduce a kind of scarcity. A pause that allows attraction to breathe, to deepen, and to grow stronger. This is not manipulation, it is simply a reflection of how human desire works. When the object of our attention is no longer always accessible, the mind begins to prioritize them, elevating their importance in our thoughts, emotions, and even subconscious processing. At the same time, the space created by no contact acts as a litmus test. For some people, attraction collapses under the weight of silence. If the emotional connection was weak, or if interest was superficial, the absence quickly erodes any sense of longing. Thoughts about the other person may fade, curiosity diminishes, and what seemed compelling in the moment loses its grip when there is no daily reinforcement. This is a natural, inevitable part of human psychology. Attraction is not guaranteed to survive in absence. It thrives on the depth of emotional investment and the quality of connection that existed before the silence. For those whose attraction does grow, the effect is profound. Each day without contact acts like a slow-burning amplifier, making the connection feel more valuable, more meaningful. Every interaction remembered becomes more significant. Every shared laugh, every subtle compliment, every inside joke becomes magnified. The mind tends to focus on positives during absence because there is no ongoing friction to dilute the memory. In this sense, no contact doesn't just preserve attraction, it intensifies it, making the eventual return of communication charged with curiosity, longing, and heightened emotional responsiveness. For this growth of attraction is also deeply tied to the psychological principle of unpredictability. When someone is consistently available, desire can plateau because predictability diminishes excitement. But when contact stops, unpredictability re-enters the dynamic. We wonder if, when, and how the other person will reach out. That unpredictability creates anticipation, suspense, and emotional tension, all of which fuel attraction. The mind and body respond physiologically. 2 heart rates may spike when imagining the other person, attention sharpens, and emotional sensitivity heightens. Silence, in this way, is not emptiness. It is a space charged with invisible energy, a silent magnet pulling the heart and mind toward the absent person. It's also worth noting that attraction is not purely about physical or superficial desire. When 2 people stop contacting each other, the emotional and psychological components of attraction become more apparent. We begin to realize what we value in the other person beyond appearance: their humor, intelligence, kindness, confidence, or emotional depth. Silence allows us to process these qualities without distraction. It separates the signal from the noise, letting us see clearly whether the attraction is genuine or merely circumstantial. When attraction survives and even grows in absence, it signals that there is substance, that the connection is deeper than convenience or habit. However, it is not a one-way street. While one person may experience intensified attraction, the other's response is equally critical. Attraction is a dynamic, reciprocal force. If both people feel the pull, even without contact, the connection can become magnetic. Thoughts, emotions, and subtle signals align in a way that often leads to spontaneous re-engagement, deepened emotional resonance, and renewed interest. If one person's attraction fades, the imbalance becomes clear and the eventual outcome, whether reconciliation, adjustment of expectations, or closure, becomes inevitable. Silence simply accelerates this revelation. The growth or collapse of attraction is also influenced by self-perception and emotional control during absence. People who manage their emotions, maintain self-respect, and engage in personal growth during the no-contact period often see attraction deepen in their favor. This is because absence not only tests desire, but also tests confidence, independence, and emotional stability, all qualities that enhance attraction. Conversely, those who appear desperate, anxious, or overly fixated are more likely to trigger a collapse in attraction. Silence doesn't just show who is drawn to whom, it shows who carries themselves in a way that sustains, that nurtures, and multiplies that attraction. Ultimately, when two people stop contacting each other, the outcome is a mirror held up to the reality of attraction. It reveals who is truly interested, who feels emotionally connected, and who is capable of longing without losing composure. Silence doesn't create attraction, it exposes it, and it also strengthens the emotional muscle required to sustain connection when contact resumes. Those who navigate the period wisely, without panic or overthinking, emerge with a clearer understanding of the other person's interest, their own feelings, and the potential of the relationship. This is why no contact is such a powerful tool in relationships. It is not about playing games, it is about creating space for the authentic dynamics of attraction to emerge. By stepping back, allowing the mind to process absence, and resisting the urge to fill every gap with messages or calls, people can observe whether desire is enduring, whether emotional investment is real, and whether the connection has the resilience to survive tension. The silence allows attraction to either flourish naturally or dissolve without illusions. In conclusion, attraction is not a static force, it is fluid, dynamic, and responsive to presence and absence. When two people stop contacting each other, attraction either grows or collapses because silence magnifies emotional truth. The mind, body, and heart are all engaged in processing absence, filling the space with anticipation, imagination, and reflection. Those who feel the pull, who value the connection, and who manage the psychological pressure thoughtfully often see attraction intensify. Those whose attachment was superficial or unbalanced may see it fade. The silence doesn't lie, it simply shows the reality of desire in its purest form. And understanding this is one of the most powerful insights anyone can have in relationships, because it teaches us that absence does not weaken connection. It reveals it. Ego and emotions are constantly interacting in every human relationship, but they do not always show themselves at the same time or in the same way. When two people stop contacting each other, ego often acts first, creating reactions that can be loud, immediate, and sometimes misleading, while emotions tend to follow more subtly, simmering beneath the surface until they eventually come to light. Understanding this dynamic is crucial because it explains why silence can feel so confusing, intense, and even frustrating, and why it often changes the trajectory of a connection in ways people do not anticipate. The first thing to understand is that ego responds to silence almost automatically. When communication stops, the ego perceives a kind of threat, an invisible challenge to status, control, or value. The mind interprets absence as potential rejection, competition, or diminished influence. It asks questions like, do they not care about me? Am I being ignored? Have I lost power in this connection? These questions are not necessarily reflective of actual emotional attachment. They are the ego's way of protecting itself, maintaining self-esteem, and asserting dominance in a dynamic where control has shifted. Because the ego acts quickly, the first responses during no contact are often defensive or performative. Some people may feel the urge to prove their worth by reaching out preemptively, by creating attention, grabbing messages, or by demonstrating that they are desirable and independent. Others may withdraw even more, creating distance in a calculated attempt to regain control, test the other person, or assert superiority. Both reactions are driven primarily by ego rather than genuine emotion. The ego wants to assert itself in the vacuum created by absence. It wants to maintain a sense of power and avoid vulnerability at all costs. Emotions, on the other hand, do not always react so immediately. They are slower, subtler, and more difficult to control. While the ego is firing off its quick responses, emotions are quietly processing. They register longing, disappointment, hope, and attachment, often in ways that are invisible to both parties. A person may act as though they are unaffected, cool, or detached because the ego is protecting them from appearing weak. Meanwhile, their emotions are simmering beneath the surface, reflecting the true depth of their investment. This delay between ego and emotion can create a sense of internal conflict. A person may feel calm and rational on the surface, while simultaneously experiencing longing, anxiety, or desire internally. This sequence, ego first, emotions later, explains a lot about human behavior during silence. For example, someone may initially react with defensiveness, arrogance, or indifference because their ego wants to protect them from vulnerability. But over time, if the emotional connection is strong, the heart begins to assert itself. They start to notice the absence, think about shared experiences, and feel the longing that their ego initially suppressed. This delayed emotional reaction often manifests as subtle behaviors. They replay conversations in their mind. They become curious about the other person's life. They reflect on what the connection means to them. Eventually, these emotions may override the ego's initial impulses, motivating genuine outreach, deeper reflection, or a change in approach. Ego also complicates the way silence is interpreted. People often confuse ego-driven responses with emotional truth. For instance, someone may reach out aggressively or dramatically after a period of silence. The other person might assume that this is an expression of deep feeling, when in fact it is often ego reacting to perceived threat or imbalance. Similarly, the absence of contact can be interpreted differently depending on which part of the psyche is dominating at the moment. If ego dominates, silence may feel like rejection or failure. If emotion dominates, silence may feel like longing or a natural pause in a meaningful connection. Full understanding which is at play helps interpret actions more accurately and avoid unnecessary misjudgment. The interplay between ego and emotion also affects timing. The ego reacts immediately because it is protective, instinctual, and concerned with status. Emotion reacts more slowly because it is reflective, vulnerable, and tied to genuine attachment. This discrepancy in timing is why the early days of no contact can feel especially confusing. You may see actions that seem contradictory. One person appears detached yet checks social media obsessively. Another seems composed yet experiences intense inner longing. These behaviors are not random. They are the natural expression of ego first, emotions following. Recognizing this allows people to navigate silence with patience, rather than reacting impulsively to surface-level behavior. Ego also interacts with pride, and pride is one of the biggest barriers to emotional expression. In silence, pride often tells a person not to reach out, not to show vulnerability, and not to admit longing. It demands a display of independence, confidence, and self-sufficiency. But emotions operate differently. They do not consider pride, they consider connection. Over time, emotions will push against pride, creating internal tension. This tension is what makes silence so psychologically intense. The longer the ego holds the line, the stronger the emotions grow beneath it, until a breaking point is reached where genuine feeling finally emerges. Interestingly, ego and emotion are not enemies. They are complementary forces when understood correctly. The ego protects against impulsive reactions, premature vulnerability, and overinvestment. Emotions ensure that authentic attachment and desire are recognized and expressed at the right time. Together, they shape the way a person responds to silence. A person who manages both wisely is able to maintain composure while honoring their feelings, showing restraint without denying emotional truth. A person who lets ego dominate may act defensively, reactively, or manipulatively, while a person who lets emotion dominate too quickly may overreach, overshare, or appear desperate. Balance is the key. Another aspect to consider is that ego often masks fear. Fear of rejection, fear of loss, fear of appearing weak. These fears drive the ego's initial responses. Emotions, in contrast, are the deeper truth behind the fear: desire, longing, and investment. Silence brings both into relief. It exposes fear, highlights attachment, and forces the individual to confront what they truly feel versus what their ego wants to display. This is why no contact is such a revealing period. It separates posturing from authenticity and shows who is genuinely invested. Ego first and emotions later also explain why people sometimes test each other during silence. Someone may wait deliberately, send indirect signals, or appear indifferent to gauge the other person's response. These tests are primarily ego-driven, a way of asserting control and assessing the balance of power. However, emotional truth is never fully suppressed. It leaks through, subtly guiding the person toward decisions, outreach, or moments of vulnerability. Over time, emotional authenticity tends to prevail because the ego alone cannot sustain a connection. Finally, understanding this dynamic is empowering. Recognizing that ego reacts first while emotions follow allows a person to interpret silence more accurately and navigate it more strategically. Instead of panicking when someone appears detached, you can understand that their ego may be dominating, while their emotions could be quietly engaged. Instead of overanalyzing early behavior, you can allow time for emotions to surface naturally, trusting that genuine attachment will reveal itself. In essence, the separation of ego and emotion gives clarity, patience, and perspective, enabling a more grounded, confident approach to relationships during no contact. Ultimately, the sequence of ego first and emotions later explains much of human behavior during silence. It clarifies why early reactions can be misleading, why internal tension is inevitable, and why authentic feelings eventually emerge. Ego is protective, reactive, and concerned with status. Emotions are reflective, vulnerable, and concerned with attachment. Understanding this interplay allows both parties to interpret behavior more accurately, manage expectations, and respond with wisdom. Silence is not empty. It is a mirror showing the interplay of ego and heart, revealing the true nature of connection and desire in a way that constant contact never can. The outcome of two people stopping contact with each other depends heavily on who breaks the silence and why, and understanding this is critical for navigating relationships with clarity, confidence, and emotional intelligence. When no one reaches out for a period of time, a subtle but powerful shift occurs. It is almost as if the absence itself begins to communicate, revealing the underlying dynamics, priorities, and feelings of each person involved. How each person responds, or whether they respond at all, ultimately determines not only the immediate state of the relationship but also its future trajectory. First, it is important to recognize that breaking the silence is not a neutral act. When someone initiates contact after a period of no communication, they are making a choice that communicates intention, desire, and value. It is a declaration, even if subtle, that the connection matters enough to overcome hesitation, pride, or uncertainty. On the other hand, continuing to remain silent also communicates a message. It demonstrates either emotional detachment, lack of interest, or a conscious decision to maintain boundaries. In this way, silence itself, like action, is an active player in the relationship, and understanding this distinction is crucial. Who breaks the silence first is often influenced by the balance of emotional investment. The person who is more invested is frequently the one who reaches out first, but that is not always the case. Sometimes emotional intelligence, self-control, or a strategic pause leads the more invested person to continue waiting. Conversely, someone with less investment may choose to reach out first for reasons related to ego, curiosity, or testing the waters. These dynamics reveal an important truth. The timing and motivation behind breaking silence provide deep insight into the nature of the connection and the intentions of each person involved. The why behind breaking silence is just as significant as the act itself. When someone reaches out from a place of genuine interest, longing, or care, the outcome is usually constructive. Their outreach can reignite connection, rebuild trust, and deepen emotional intimacy. When the motivation is ego-driven, seeking validation, control, or reassurance, the outcome is less predictable and can sometimes introduce tension or confusion. For example, a message sent simply to check whether the other person still cares may generate anxiety rather than meaningful engagement. Conversely, a message sent from a place of authentic curiosity and warmth is far more likely to produce a positive response and restore harmony in the interaction. Timing is also critical in determining the outcome. Reaching out too soon can appear reactive or desperate, signaling that the ego is in control rather than emotions being processed with clarity. Waiting too long, however, may allow misunderstandings, assumptions, or fading interest to take root. There is a delicate balance in understanding when enough time has passed to allow both people to process their feelings, reflect on the relationship, and approach contact with intention. Those who can master this timing are often the ones who regain influence, respect, and emotional resonance in the connection. Another factor that determines the outcome is the history of the relationship itself. Silence affects relationships differently depending on the depth of emotional connection, the quality of shared experiences, and the level of trust that has been built. In connections with strong foundations, the absence can intensify feelings and allow both people to reflect on the value of what they share. In relationships where the foundation is weaker or where attachment is superficial, the silence often reveals that the connection is not as significant as assumed, and it may collapse when tested. Therefore, breaking silence is not just about action, it is about understanding the underlying strength of the bond and responding in a way that honors that reality. The person who breaks silence also gains a psychological advantage in terms of clarity. Initiating contact demonstrates confidence, self-awareness, and willingness to engage thoughtfully, which can shift perceptions of value and influence within the relationship. At the same time, choosing not to break silence conveys emotional strength, independence, and boundary setting. Both approaches can be effective when aligned with intention, self-respect, and an understanding of the desired outcome. The key is that neither action is neutral. Both carry meaning, and both shape the trajectory of the connection. Emotional self-awareness is essential for understanding who should break silence and why. Many people break contact impulsively, driven by fear, insecurity, or the desire to provoke a response. This usually produces inconsistent results because the underlying intention is reactive rather than intentional. In contrast, breaking silence from a place of reflection and emotional maturity produces outcomes that are more aligned with long-term goals, whether that is deepening connection, clarifying mutual feelings, or maintaining self-respect. The difference between impulsive action and intentional action is subtle but powerful, and it often determines whether the outcome strengthens the bond or simply introduces further uncertainty. The response of the other person is equally important. When someone receives contact after a period of silence, their reaction reflects their own emotional investment, values, and intentions. If the recipient responds positively, with curiosity, warmth, or engagement, it indicates that attraction, interest, and connection remain strong. If the recipient responds indifferently, defensively, or with minimal effort, it may indicate a lack of genuine investment or emotional alignment. Observing these reactions provides clarity and insight that is often not visible during regular, constant communication. Silence functions as a filter, allowing each person to see the truth about their partner's feelings and priorities. Breaking silence can also serve as a catalyst for personal growth. When approached thoughtfully, it requires self-reflection, emotional regulation, and a clear understanding of one's own needs and desires. It demands that a person examine their motivations. Are you reaching out because you truly want connection, or because you are seeking validation? Are you respecting your own boundaries, or are you sacrificing self-respect to maintain engagement? This self-awareness not only influences the immediate outcome of the interaction, but also contributes to greater emotional intelligence, confidence, and relationship skills in the long term. It is also worth noting that breaking silence is not always necessary for closure or resolution. Sometimes, the most powerful choice is to remain silent, allowing both parties the space to process their feelings and clarify their intentions independently. Silence can create clarity by showing who truly misses whom, who values the connection, and who is willing to wait while maintaining integrity and self-respect. Choosing not to break silence can be as intentional and effective as initiating contact, provided it is done with awareness rather than avoidance or fear. Ultimately, the outcome of no contact hinges on understanding both who is breaking the silence and why. The act itself communicates intention, emotion, and value, while the timing and motivation shape the response of the other person and the future of the relationship. Silence is not empty, it is a test, a mirror, and a revelation. It reveals who is genuinely invested, who is emotionally mature, and who can navigate absence with clarity and confidence. Those who approach it thoughtfully, whether by breaking the silence intentionally or by maintaining it wisely, gain insight, influence, and emotional alignment. The most important lesson is that breaking silence is never just about sending a message. It is about understanding the psychological and emotional dynamics at play, respecting both your own feelings and those of the other person, and acting from a place of clarity rather than reaction. When approached with awareness, breaking silence becomes a tool for insight, connection, and empowerment. It allows the truth of emotional investment to emerge, creates opportunities for meaningful engagement, and sets the stage for a relationship that is balanced, authentic, and aligned with the intentions of both people involved. Silence is a revealing force, and who acts first, and why they act, determines the outcome. It separates genuine connection from superficial attachment, clarifies intentions, and exposes emotional priorities. It allows each person to see clearly what the other values, who is willing to engage authentically, and how the bond can evolve. Breaking silence with purpose, patience, and understanding transforms a period of absence into an opportunity for insight, growth, and meaningful connection. It is in this moment, the choice to act or to wait with awareness, that the true outcome of two people stopping contact becomes clear. Here's a powerful Matthew Hussey style conclusion that ties all 5 keynotes together and wraps your speech in a compelling, emotional, and actionable way. So, what does all of this mean? When two people stop contacting each other, silence is not the end. It is the most revealing part of any connection. Silence exposes the truth that constant conversation can often hide. It shows us who is genuinely invested, who feels deeply, and who values the connection enough to endure the space without panic. It shows us how psychological pressure works, how attraction either grows or fades in absence, how ego and emotions dance in tandem, and finally, how the outcome is shaped by the choices we make about when, why, and whether to break that silence. Think about it. Every unanswered message, every pause, every quiet moment carries meaning. The person who feels it most is not always the one who texts first. It's the one whose heart and mind are quietly engaged even when the ego tries to protect them. Attraction is not lost in silence, it either intensifies or collapses, depending on the depth of connection. Emotional truth doesn't disappear because words aren't being exchanged. It simmers beneath the surface, waiting for recognition. And the decisions we make during this time, whether to reach out, wait, or reflect, determine the trajectory of the relationship more than anything else. Here's the final truth I want you to walk away with: silence is not something to fear. It is a mirror. It shows you who you are, what you truly want, and what the other person feels without the noise of constant interaction. If you understand the dynamics of ego versus emotion, the way attraction grows or fades, and the psychological pressure that silence naturally creates, you can navigate this period with confidence, clarity, and self-respect. You can observe, reflect, and act intentionally rather than reacting out of fear or impulse. And when that moment comes, the first message, the first reach out, or even the choice to continue waiting, you will do so from a place of understanding, not desperation. You will know what your heart feels, what your mind has realized, and what the connection really is. Silence has revealed the truth, and now you have the power to respond wisely. That is the beauty of stopping contact. It is not absence, it is insight. It is not loss, it is clarity. So, the next time you find yourself in that space, that quiet pause between two people who were once connected, remember this: do not panic. Do not chase, observe. Listen to what the silence is telling you, feel the emotional truth. Understand the role of ego, the intensity of attraction, and the weight of psychological pressure. And then make your move, not out of fear, not out of habit, but out of awareness, full confidence and clarity. Because the outcome is never just about who texts first or who waits longer. The outcome is about emotional truth, mutual value, and self-respect. And when you approach it this way, silence no longer feels like a punishment. It feels like the greatest opportunity. You have to see the real dynamics of love, connection, and human desire. So, take a deep breath, trust the process, and let the silence speak. Because what it tells you will change everything.